The Last Cowboy. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me your country and city in the comments because I enjoy seeing people from different corners of the world come together through stories. If you enjoy heartfelt tales about courage, family, and unforgettable life lessons, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our growing community. Your support inspires us to bring you more meaningful stories every week. My name is Thomas Walker, and for most of my life, people knew me as the last cowboy in our little valley. They saw the weathered hat on my head, the old leather boots covered in dust, and the horse that had been my companion for nearly 20 years. What they never saw were the memories hidden behind my smile or the promises I had carried in silence for decades. This isn't just a story about horses, ranches, or the fading days of the Old West. It's the story of a life shaped by hard work, heartbreaking loss, unexpected friendships, and one final journey that changed everything I believed about family, forgiveness, and hope. If you're ready, let me take you back to the day it all began. The morning that changed my life forever began like hundreds of others before it. I woke long before sunrise, just as I had every day since I was a young boy. The ranch was quiet except for the gentle sound of the wind brushing against the old wooden barn. I pulled on my faded boots, placed my weathered hat on my head, and stepped outside. The cool air carried the familiar scent of fresh grass and damp earth. It reminded me that no matter how much the world changed, the land always kept its promises. My horse, Ranger, was already waiting by the fence. He lifted his head the moment he heard my footsteps. I smiled and rubbed his neck. Ranger had been with me through storms, droughts, celebrations, and heartbreaks. There were days when he understood me better than most people ever had. As we rode across the pasture, I couldn't help noticing how different everything looked. Many of my neighbors had sold their ranches. The wide fields where cattle once grazed were slowly turning into neighborhoods, filled with new houses. Wooden fences had been replaced by paved roads. Children no longer dreamed of becoming cowboys. They dreamed of office jobs, computers, and city life. I couldn't blame them. Times were changing. But deep inside, I wondered if there would still be a place for someone like me. By noon, I returned to the house, where a dusty pickup truck was parked outside. I hadn't expected visitors. A young man wearing polished boots stepped out and introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. He worked for a development company interested in buying my land. He smiled politely and handed me a folder filled with papers. "Mr. Walker," he said, "we're prepared to make you a generous offer. This property could become one of the finest residential communities in the county." I looked past him toward the rolling hills. My father had built this ranch with his own hands. Every fence post carried memories. Every tree had witnessed birthdays, weddings, and quiet evenings around a campfire. "I appreciate the offer," I replied calmly, "but this land isn't for sale." Daniel seemed surprised. "You should at least think about it," he said. "You'd never have to work another day." I smiled softly. "I've never considered taking care of this ranch to be work." He nodded respectfully before climbing back into his truck, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. That evening, I sat alone on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The silence felt heavier than usual. For the first time in years, I wondered what would happen after I was gone. I had no children to inherit the ranch, no family living nearby, and very few friends left in town. The question stayed with me long after darkness settled over the valley. Little did I know that before another week had passed, a stranger would arrive at my gate with a worn backpack, tired eyes, and a request that would change the course of both our lives forever. The next morning I woke before the first light touched the hills. The question that had followed me the night before still lingered in my mind. What would become of this ranch when I was gone? I tried to push the thought aside. A cowboy learns early in life that worrying never mends a broken fence or feeds hungry cattle. After saddling Ranger, I headed toward the north pasture. The cattle were scattered across the open field, peacefully grazing beneath the pale morning sky. Everything seemed ordinary until Ranger suddenly slowed his pace and let out a quiet snort. His ears stood upright, fixed on something near the old entrance gate. From a distance, I noticed a young man sitting against the wooden fence, He carried a worn backpack, and his clothes were covered with dust from the road. He looked exhausted, as though he hadn't slept in days. As I rode closer, he slowly stood up and removed his cap. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. "I'm sorry to bother you." I studied him for a moment. His face was young, perhaps no older than 25, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had already faced too many disappointments. "What brings you here?" I asked. "My name is Ethan," he replied. "I've been traveling for a while looking for work. People in the last town told me there might still be an old ranch around here." I smiled faintly. "Well, you found it." He looked around the property with quiet admiration. "I've never worked on a ranch before," he admitted honestly, "but I'm willing to learn. I just need a chance." His words reminded me of myself many years earlier, standing beside my father with empty hands and a heart full of determination. "I can't promise easy work," I told him. "I've never asked for easy," he answered. There was something genuine about the way he spoke. No excuses, no false confidence, just honesty. I invited him inside for breakfast. As we sat at the old kitchen table, he ate slowly, almost as if he wasn't used to having a proper meal. Between bites, he shared pieces of his story. His parents had passed away several years earlier. Since then, he had taken whatever jobs he could find, moving from town to town. Every time he thought he had found stability, life seemed to pull it away again. "I guess I'm still looking for a place that feels like home," he said quietly. Those words stayed with me. After breakfast, I handed him an extra pair of work gloves. "If you're serious," I said, "let's see what you've got." The rest of the day was filled with repairing fences, cleaning the barn and feeding the horses. Ethan struggled at first. He had never handled ranch equipment, and more than once he made mistakes that left us both laughing. But what impressed me wasn't his skill, it was his determination. Every time something went wrong, he asked how to do it better instead of giving up. As the sun began to set, we stood beside the barn, watching the sky turn shades of orange and gold. "You know," I said, "most people your age wouldn't last a single day out here." He smiled. "Maybe I finally found the place I was meant to be." I didn't answer, but deep inside, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. I had no idea that Ethan's arrival was only the beginning. Within days, secrets from both of our pasts would begin to surface, and the peaceful ranch I had spent a lifetime protecting would face its greatest challenge yet. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan was already outside filling the water troughs or preparing feed for the horses. He still had plenty to learn, but his willingness to work never faded. Each evening, he asked questions about ranch life, and I answered them the same way my father had once answered mine. "Why do you check every fence even when it looks fine?" he asked one afternoon. "Because small problems become big ones when you ignore them," I replied. He nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like advice for more than just fences." I smiled. Most lessons on a ranch work that way. As the weeks passed, Ethan became more confident. Ranger accepted him, which surprised me. Horses have a way of judging a person's character long before people do. Seeing Ranger calmly follow Ethan told me more than words ever could. One Saturday, we rode into town for supplies. It had been months since I'd spent much time there. The old feed store was still standing, but many of the businesses I remembered had disappeared. New buildings had taken their place, and the streets were busier than ever. While loading supplies into the truck, I noticed several people looking in my direction. Some smiled politely, while others whispered among themselves. On our way back, Ethan finally asked, "Do they always look at you like that?" I laughed quietly. "Most of them remember when this town was built around ranches. Now they think I'm too stubborn to accept that the world has changed." "And are you?" "Maybe," I admitted. "But some things are worth holding on to." When we returned to the ranch, a black SUV was parked outside my house. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I recognized Daniel Brooks. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood beside him, dressed in expensive suits, carefully studying every acre of my property. Daniel greeted me with the same confident smile. "Mr. Walker, I was hoping you'd reconsider our offer." "I already gave you my answer." He opened a folder and showed me new documents. "This offer is much higher than the last one. It would be enough for you to retire comfortably for the rest of your life. I looked at the papers for only a second before handing them back. My father didn't spend his life building this ranch, so I could sell it to the highest bidder. Daniel's smile slowly disappeared. I respect your feelings, he said.
But progress doesn't wait forever.
I met his eyes. Neither does a man's integrity. Without another word, he climbed into the SUV and drove away. That evening, Ethan seemed unusually quiet. Do you think they'll come back? He asked. I believe they will. And if they keep offering more money? I looked across the fields, glowing beneath the setting sun. And there comes a point when money can't buy what matters most. Ethan stared across the ranch in silence. I wish I'd had someone teach me that years ago. For the first time, I realized he wasn't only searching for work. He had been searching for guidance, for belonging, and perhaps even for the family life he had lost. Neither of us knew it yet, but Daniel Brooks wasn't ready to give up. Before long, he would make a move that threatened not only my ranch, but also the trust Ethan and I had begun to build together. That was the moment our quiet life would truly be tested. The following week began peacefully, but I had lived long enough to know that peace can disappear without warning. The ranch carried on as it always had. The cattle needed feeding, the horses needed care, and the fences demanded constant attention. Life on a ranch doesn't stop because trouble is waiting on the horizon. Ethan had become a different man in just a few weeks. His hands, once soft from odd jobs in town, were now rough from hard work. He no longer hesitated before climbing into the saddle, and Ranger had grown comfortable riding beside him. Watching him learn reminded me of my younger days, when my father patiently taught me everything he knew. One afternoon, while we were repairing an old windmill, Ethan asked, "Did you ever want to leave this place?" I leaned against the wooden frame and looked across the endless fields. Once, I admitted. He looked surprised. When I was about your age, I thought the city had everything I could ever want. Bigger opportunities, better money, an easier life. I packed my bags and left. What happened? I stayed away for less than a year. Why? Because every morning I missed the sound of horses, the smell of fresh grass after the rain, and the feeling that my work meant something. I realized the ranch wasn't holding me back. It was giving me purpose. Ethan smiled quietly. I think I'm starting to understand. That evening, as we returned to the house, something immediately caught my attention. The front gate was hanging open. I always closed that gate. Ranger became restless beneath me, sensing that something wasn't right. We hurried toward the barn. My heart sank. Several fence panels had been broken, and a small group of cattle had wandered into the neighboring pasture. Someone had clearly forced their way onto the property. Without wasting a second, Ethan and I split up to gather the animals before darkness fell. It took us hours of riding across rough fields, calling the cattle back together. By the time we returned, both of us were exhausted. Inside the barn, I examined the broken lock lying on the ground. This wasn't an accident, I said quietly. Ethan looked around. Do you think someone was trying to scare you?
I don't know.
The next morning, I drove into town to report the damage. The sheriff listened carefully before shaking his head. We'll keep an eye on things, Thomas, he said. But without witnesses, it'll be difficult to prove who did it. As I walked outside, I noticed Daniel Brooks standing across the street. He tipped his hat politely. Rough night? He asked. His words sounded innocent, but something about his smile made me uneasy. I didn't accuse him. Instead, I simply answered, Some people think land is only valuable because of money. They're forgetting that character is worth far more. His smile faded for just a moment before he turned and walked away. When I returned to the ranch, Ethan could tell something was bothering me. You think he knows more than he's saying, Ethan said. I do. Then what are we going to do? I looked around at the ranch that had been my home for nearly my entire life. We're going to protect what's ours. Not with anger, not with revenge, with patience, honesty, and hard work. That's how my father taught me, and that's how we'll face whatever comes next. Ethan nodded without hesitation. At that moment, neither of us realized that. The greatest challenge wasn't coming from outside the ranch. It was already on its way, hidden inside a letter that would arrive before the end of the week. A letter that would uncover a secret from my past. I had spent decades trying to forget. 3 days after the break-in, the mail truck rolled slowly up the dusty road and stopped in front of the house. The driver handed me a small bundle of letters and tipped his cap before driving away. Most of it was routine: feed invoices, utility bills, and a farming magazine I had subscribed to for years. But one envelope stood out. It was old, slightly faded, and had my full name, written in careful handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Ethan noticed the expression on my face. "Everything all right?" he asked. "I honestly don't know." I carried the envelope onto the porch and sat in the old wooden rocking chair. My hands felt heavier than usual as I carefully opened it. Inside was a single letter. As I read the first few lines, memories I had buried years ago came rushing back. The letter was from Margaret. She had been the only woman I had ever planned to marry. When we were young, we dreamed about building a life together on this ranch. We imagined children running through the fields, horses grazing beyond the fence, and growing old, side by side. But life had other plans. Her family moved away after her father accepted a job in another state. We promised to write, but as the years passed, the letters became fewer until they stopped altogether. I'd never known what became of her. The letter explained everything. Margaret had passed away only a few months earlier after a long illness. Before she died, she had asked her granddaughter to send me the letter she had kept hidden for many years. My hands trembled as I continued reading. She wrote that she had never forgotten the ranch, never forgotten the promises we made beneath the old oak tree, and never stopped wondering what kind of man I had become. At the end of the letter was one sentence that stayed with me. "I hope you found the family we once dreamed of." I quietly folded the letter and looked across the fields. For the first time in many years, I couldn't find the words to speak. Ethan sat beside me without saying anything. After several minutes, I handed him the letter. He read it slowly before looking back at me. "I'm sorry, Thomas." I smiled sadly. "Life doesn't always give us the ending we expect." That evening, we rode toward the hill overlooking the ranch. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. "I spent years believing I had lost everything that mattered," I finally said. Ethan looked at me. "And now?" I looked at the ranch below us. "Now I realize something." "What?" "A man doesn't spend his life counting what he lost. He measures it by what he still has." Ethan remained quiet for a moment. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have." "What is that?" "A place where I belong." His words meant more to me than he could ever know. For the first time in decades, the ranch didn't feel empty anymore. But just as hope was beginning to return, a cloud of dust appeared on the road leading toward the house. A county vehicle stopped at the front gate. A man stepped out carrying an official folder. As he walked toward us, his expression was serious. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'm afraid I have some important news regarding your property." The way he said those words told me immediately that whatever was inside that folder had the power to change the future of the ranch forever. The county official stood quietly at the edge of my porch, holding the folder tightly against his chest. I invited him inside, but he politely shook his head. "I won't take much of your time," he said. Ethan joined me on the porch, sensing that whatever this man had come to say wasn't good news. The official opened the folder and removed several documents. "Mr. Walker, the county has received a proposal for a new highway extension. One of the planned routes crosses a portion of your property." For a moment I couldn't speak. "A highway?" I finally asked. He nodded. "It's only a proposal right now. Nothing has been approved, but if this route is selected, part of your ranch could be purchased for public use." I looked out across the fields where my father had taught me to ride a horse. Every hill, every tree, every fence carried a memory. The thought of dividing the ranch felt like tearing pages from the story of my life. "How much land are we talking about?" I asked. He unfolded a map and pointed to a red line. Nearly a third of the grazing pasture would be affected. After answering a few more questions, the official left, promising that I would receive more information in the coming weeks. Neither Ethan nor I spoke for several minutes after his truck disappeared down the road. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think this has anything to do with Daniel Brooks?" "I can't say for certain," I replied. But the timing certainly makes me wonder. That afternoon, we rode along the boundary shown on the map. The pasture stretched peacefully beneath the clear blue sky, as if it had no idea that someone far away had drawn a line across it with a pen. Ethan climbed down from his horse and picked up a handful of soil. "It doesn't seem right," he said. "People making decisions about land they've probably never even walked on." I smiled. My father used to tell me that land isn't something we truly own. We're only trusted to care for it while we're here. Ethan looked around thoughtfully. "Then you've done a good job keeping that promise." His words stayed with me. That evening, several neighbors unexpectedly arrived at the ranch. Some I hadn't spoken to in months, others in years. Old Mr. Harrison stepped forward first. "We heard about the highway." "So did I answered. He removed his hat. "I sold my ranch years ago, Thomas. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. I don't want to see yours disappear too." One by one, the others shared similar feelings. They remembered the days when the valley was filled with ranches and open fields. They remembered community gatherings, cattle drives, and neighbors helping one another without expecting anything in return. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't standing alone. Before leaving, Mr. Harrison handed me a small wooden box. "It belonged to your father," he said. "He left it with me years ago for safekeeping. He told me to give it to you when the time felt right." I stared at the worn box in surprise. "I had no idea this even existed." "Neither did anyone else," he replied with a gentle smile. After everyone left, Ethan and I carried the box inside. It was locked. There was no key. We carefully examined every side until Ethan noticed a tiny, hidden compartment underneath. Inside lay an old brass key wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. I took a deep breath before unlocking the box. The lid creaked open slowly. Inside were several yellowed photographs, my father's leather-bound journal, and a folded envelope with my name written across the front. As I reached for the envelope, I felt my heart begin to race. Something told me that whatever my father had written all those years ago would reveal a truth that could change not only my future, but the future of the ranch itself. For several long moments, I simply stared at the envelope. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, steady, confident, and familiar. It had been many years since I had seen it, yet it felt as though he was standing beside me once again. Ethan remained silent. He understood that some moments deserved respect more than conversation. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My son, if you are reading this, then life has brought you to a crossroads. I know you well enough to believe you have carried every burden alone, just as I once did. But remember this, a strong man isn't measured by how much he can carry. He's measured by what he chooses to protect." I paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "The ranch has never truly been about cattle, horses, or land. It has always been about people. A good home is built by kindness, honesty, and the willingness to help those who have nowhere else to go. If you ever find someone who needs a second chance, don't be afraid to give it. One day they may protect this place better than you ever could." Without realizing it, I looked toward Ethan. He was standing near the window, pretending to admire the sunset, but I could tell he had heard every word. Inside the box were several old photographs. One showed my father shaking hands with neighbors after helping rebuild a barn destroyed by a storm. Another captured my mother smiling beside the garden she loved so much. I hadn't looked at those memories in years. Then I opened the leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with notes about ranch life, weather patterns, cattle records, planting seasons, and lessons my father wanted me to remember. One entry caught my attention. "A ranch survives because people stand together. The day neighbors stop helping one. Another is the day the land begins to lose its spirit."
I quietly closed the journal. "I wish I had read this years ago," I whispered. Ethan smiled gently. "Maybe you were meant to read it now." The following morning, I made a decision. Instead of worrying about the future, I would spend my time preserving everything my father had taught me. Ethan and I began repairing old sections of the ranch that had been neglected for years. We restored broken fences, repainted the barn doors, and cleaned equipment that hadn't been used in decades. Word slowly spread through the valley. Before long, neighbors began arriving without being asked. Some brought lumber, others brought tools, a few simply brought willing hands. For the first time in many years, laughter echoed across the ranch again. Watching everyone work together reminded me of the community I had grown up in. Late that afternoon, a familiar black SUV stopped outside the gate. Daniel Brooks stepped out. This time, there was no smile on his face. He looked at the volunteers working across the ranch and then walked directly toward me. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. I folded my arms. Neither did I. He glanced around at the families repairing fences and painting barns. "You've brought this whole community together." "No," I replied calmly. "They chose to come." Daniel remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You still have time to sell." I looked around at the people giving their afternoon to help an old cowboy protect his home. "I think you finally understand why I never will." Daniel sighed, nodded once, and walked back to his vehicle. As he drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Something in his expression had changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It looked more like determination. Deep inside, I knew our greatest challenge was still waiting ahead, and whatever happened next would decide the future of the ranch once and for all. The morning after Daniel Brooks drove away, the ranch felt unusually quiet. The neighbors had returned to their own homes, but the signs of their kindness were everywhere. Freshly repaired fences stretched across the pastures. The barn doors wore a new coat of paint, and the old windmill turned steadily in the breeze once again. As I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't carrying the weight of the ranch alone anymore. Ethan walked out of the house with a notebook in his hand. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking about everything your father wrote." "So did I." He opened the notebook. "I started making a list of repairs we can finish before winter. If we're going to protect this place, we should prepare for every season." I smiled. "You're beginning to think like a rancher." For the next several days, we worked from sunrise until dusk. We repaired the old corral, replaced broken roof shingles on the equipment shed,
and planted new trees along the western fence, where years of strong winds had left the land exposed. One afternoon, while clearing an overgrown section near the creek, Ethan's shovel struck something solid. "Thomas," he called, "come take a look." I walked over and knelt beside him. Buried beneath the soil was an old metal box, rusted with age. Together we carefully lifted it from the ground. The lock had long since fallen apart. Inside were several old keepsakes, my father's pocket watch, a handful of faded family photographs, and a neatly folded map of the ranch drawn decades earlier. Tucked inside the map was a handwritten note. "If this box is ever found, remember that the greatest treasure on this ranch is not hidden beneath the ground. It lives in the people who choose to call it home." I couldn't help but smile. "Even after all these years," I said softly, "my father was still teaching me." That evening the phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison. "Thomas," he said, "you should turn on the local news." I switched on the television. The reporter was standing beside a large map of the county. "The proposed highway route has received significant public opposition," she explained. "Residents have submitted hundreds of letters asking county leaders to preserve the historic ranch land and protect local farms." Images appeared on the screen. There were photographs of my ranch, interviews with neighbors, and even clips of families who had spent the previous weekend helping repair the property. Ethan looked at me in disbelief. "They're fighting for the ranch." I nodded quietly. "They're fighting for something bigger than the ranch." The following Saturday, the town organized a community gathering at the old fairgrounds. Families, ranchers, shop owners, teachers, and students filled the open field. Many people I had never even met walked up to shake my hand. One elderly woman smiled warmly. "My grandfather worked for your father many years ago," she said. "He always told us that the Walker Ranch welcomed anyone willing to work honestly. We haven't forgotten." Her words touched me more deeply than I could express. As the afternoon drew to a close, the mayor stepped onto the small wooden stage. He thanked everyone for coming before making an announcement. "In 1 week's time, the county board will hold its final meeting to decide the future of the highway project." The crowd fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. One meeting, one decision, one chance to protect everything generations had built together. As we drove home beneath the setting sun, Ethan broke the silence. No matter what happens next, you've already accomplished something remarkable. What do you mean? You reminded an entire town that some places are worth protecting. I looked out across the golden fields as the ranch came into view. For the first time since this journey began, I wasn't afraid of the future. But I also knew that the most important day of my life was only a week away. And whatever happened that would shape the ending of my story forever. The week leading up to the county board meeting passed more slowly than any I could remember. Every sunrise seemed quieter, and every sunset carried the feeling that time was slipping through my fingers. I tried to keep myself busy with ranch work, but my thoughts always returned to the same question. Would this be the last season the ranch remained untouched? Ethan noticed the worry on my face, even when I tried to hide it. "You've done everything you could," he said one morning as we repaired a section of fencing. "I know," I replied, "but sometimes doing your best doesn't guarantee the outcome you hope for." He looked at me with a calm smile. "Maybe, but it gives you something even more important." "And what's that?" "Peace, knowing you never stopped fighting for what mattered." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day. A few evenings later, the entire community gathered at the ranch. Families brought homemade meals. Children laughed as they chased one another across the yard, and old friends shared stories around a small campfire. As I watched everyone together, I realized this was exactly what my father had meant in his letter. The ranch had never been just a piece of land. It was a place where people found friendship, purpose, and hope. Mr. Harrison stood and gently tapped his coffee cup with a spoon. "I'd like to say something." The conversation slowly faded. "I've lived in this valley for over 70 years, he began. "I've seen droughts, storms, hard winters, and difficult times. But I've also seen neighbors help each other, without expecting anything in return. Thomas Walker has carried that tradition his entire life. If this ranch disappears, we'll lose more than open land." Everyone listened quietly. "We'll lose part of who we are." The crowd answered with warm applause. The next morning was the day of the county meeting. I drove into town before sunrise. As we approached the courthouse, I was surprised by what I saw. The sidewalk was filled with people. Some held handmade signs that read, "Protect our ranches. History matters. Community comes first." Many waved as I stepped out of the truck. I recognized neighbors, teachers, firefighters, local business owners, and even families who had recently moved to the valley. Seeing them there brought a lump to my throat. Inside the meeting hall, every seat was occupied. County officials sat at the front while residents quietly filled the room. The chairman welcomed everyone before inviting speakers to share their thoughts. Several people stood one after another. A schoolteacher explained how students visited the ranch every year to learn about local history. A shop owner spoke about how ranch families had supported small businesses for generations. A young mother described bringing her children to community events held on the property. Then my name was called. I slowly walked to the podium. For a moment, I simply looked around the room. "I've spent my entire life on one piece of land," I began. "I've watched seasons change, children grow into parents, and neighbors become lifelong friends." The room remained completely silent. "I understand that progress is important." I paused. "But progress should never require us to forget the people who built the communities we enjoy today." I looked toward the county board. "This ranch doesn't belong only to me." I glanced at Ethan, then at the families sitting throughout the room. "It belongs to every memory created there, every lesson passed from one generation to the next, and every person who still believes that kindness and hard work matter." When I stepped away from the podium, the room filled with quiet applause. The chairman thanked everyone and announced that the board would now begin its private discussion before delivering the final decision later that afternoon. As Ethan and I walked outside, neither of us spoke. The hardest part was over. Now all we could do was wait. Neither of us knew that before the sun set. A single announcement from those courthouse doors would determine whether the Walker Ranch had a future or whether my journey as the last cowboy was about to reach its final chapter. Ethan and I sat on a wooden bench beneath the old oak tree outside the courthouse. The afternoon sun hung high above us, but neither of us noticed the heat. Every few minutes the courthouse doors opened, and people stepped in or out. Yet no one knew when the county board would announce its decision. The waiting was harder than any day's work I had ever done. I'd rather mend 100 miles of fence than sit here another hour, I said with a quiet laugh. Ethan smiled. I believe you. Neighbors gathered around us, offering encouraging words. Mrs. Carter handed me a bottle of water, while Mr. Harrison rested a hand on my shoulder. No matter what happens, he said, this town already knows what you've given us. His words meant more than he realized. Nearly 2 hours later, the courthouse doors finally opened. The chairman stepped outside with the rest of the county board behind him. The crowd quickly fell silent. He unfolded a sheet of paper and looked across the people gathered before speaking. After carefully reviewing the proposal, hearing public comments, and considering the historical importance of the Walker Ranch and the surrounding farmland, the board has reached its decision. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stand still. The proposed highway route through the Walker Ranch has been rejected. A wave of cheers swept across the crowd. People clapped, embraced one another, and smiled with relief.
Ethan let out a long breath before wrapping me in a hug. We did it, he said. I looked around at the faces surrounding me. No, I replied. We all did. As the celebration continued, I noticed Daniel Brooks standing near the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. He slowly walked toward me. I came to congratulate you, he said. I wasn't expecting that. He nodded. Neither was I, but watching this community stand together made me realize something. I waited quietly. I spent years believing land was valuable because of what could be built on it. He glanced toward the people celebrating. Today I learned it's valuable because of what already exists. He extended his hand. I'm sorry for pushing so hard. I shook his hand. We all have the chance to learn. For the first time since we met, we parted with mutual respect. That evening, the ranch was filled with more people than I had seen in decades. Neighbors brought food, musicians played old country songs, children laughed as they ran across the fields, and the sunset painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson. As I stood beside the barn, Ethan walked over carrying my father's journal. I've been thinking, he said. About what? Everything your father wrote. He hesitated before continuing. I don't think he wanted this ranch to end with one family. I looked at him carefully. What do you mean? I think he wanted it to become a place where anyone willing to work honestly and help others could always find a home. I smiled. I believe you're right. That night, after everyone had gone home, we sat quietly on the porch. The stars stretched across the sky just as they had when I was a boy. I reached into my pocket and took out my father's old pocket watch. It had stopped working years ago, but I kept it because it reminded me that time isn't measured only by hours. It's measured by the lives we touch. I looked toward Ethan. You came here asking for a job. He nodded. But somewhere along the way, you became family. His eyes filled with emotion, but he couldn't find the words. Neither could I. We simply sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the wind move gently through the fields. Deep inside, I knew there was still one final promise left to keep, a promise that would ensure the ranch, its values, and its story would continue long after I was gone. The morning after the celebration, I woke before sunrise, just as I always had. Old habits have a way of staying with you, no matter how much life changes. I stepped outside with a warm cup of coffee in my hands and watched the first rays of sunlight spread across the valley. The grass shimmered with dew, the horses grazed peacefully in the pasture, and Ranger stood quietly by the fence, looking as proud as ever. For the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. The ranch was still standing. The community was stronger than ever, and I no longer felt alone. A few days later, I asked Ethan to ride with me to the highest hill on the property. It was the same place where my father had once taken me as a young boy. From there, you could see nearly every acre of the ranch. We sat in silence for a while before I finally spoke. My father once told me that a good cowboy doesn't spend his life trying to own the land. Ethan looked at me. He spends his life taking care of it. Ethan nodded. And when his time comes, he leaves it better than he found it. I reached into my saddlebag and removed a folder. Inside were legal documents I had spent the past few days preparing. Ethan looked confused. What are these? I've made arrangements for the future of the ranch. He slowly opened the folder. The documents explained that The Walker Ranch would remain a working ranch dedicated to preserving its history, teaching future generations about ranch life, and welcoming young people who wanted to learn honest work and responsibility. A small community trust would oversee its future so that the land would never be divided or forgotten. Ethan looked at me with surprise. "You've trusted me with this?" "I haven't trusted you with land," I replied. "I've trusted you with a promise." He lowered his eyes, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know if I'm worthy." I smiled. My father once trusted a young boy who didn't know the first thing about running a ranch. I paused before adding, "He turned out just fine." A quiet laugh escaped both of us. As autumn arrived, the ranch became busier than ever. Local schools began bringing students to learn about horses, farming, and the history of the valley. Families visited on weekends, volunteers helped maintain the trails, and neighbors continued gathering for community events. Everywhere I looked, I saw life, not because the ranch had become famous, but because people had remembered what it stood for. One crisp evening, Ethan and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You know," he said, "people still call you the Last Cowboy." I smiled and slowly shook my head. "No." He looked at me curiously. "I was never meant to be the last." I pointed toward the pasture, where several young volunteers were learning to ride horses, under the guidance of experienced ranchers. As long as there are people willing to live with honesty, work hard, help their neighbors, and respect the land, there will always be another cowboy. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, covering the valley in a warm golden light. I took one final look across the ranch that had shaped every chapter of my life. I thought about my parents, the friends I had lost, the neighbors